All right, everybody, welcome to the last meetup, Tinderbox Meetup, March 29th for our last meetup for March. I cannot believe Q1 of 2025 is already over, but it is. So let's jump right in. Unfortunately, our guest speaker for today had a last minute work trip, so he will not be able to make it. And he's promised to Jacob Evans, and he has promised to record a video of his Chat GPT AI stuff so that we can learn from him and what's going on. So typically our format for doing these meetings is we go around the room and we have new people introduce themselves, and I don't see anyone new. And then we have a theme, which we would jump into, which we did, but we don't now today. So we will move on from that. Then we have anybody talk about any particular projects of interest that they want to work on. And if you guys don't have any, I have a particular project I would love to cogitate with you all on and spend time on. But before I can say what the project I would like to do today, if we're so inclined, is there's been a really interesting discussion in the Tinderbox backstage that was raised by a member who's has been espousing that we need to make a easier Tinderbox UI and improve the UI. And I think the dialogue has been very interesting. And if you are all so inclined, I produced a concepts file I'd like to share with you. And my proposal was maybe we can reframe the discussion and not talk about trying to quote unquote air quotes fix the UI, and walk through what we think a really good onboarding process would be. So for example, if someone got Tinderbox, can we give them this, like one of my kind of, and like what Chuck and I are doing, can we give them like this installer file and say, install this file and it will step you through like the 5 common things you need to learn how to do. And so I would like us to think through and actually use Tinderbox. Let's do a live collective session of using Tinderbox to think and mind map and outline, and let's see how far we get on what it would mean collectively as a team to be developing this onboarding Tinderbox file. And then based on that, I'll make the commitment of actually building that. So I think that would be really fun. Chuck.
Okay, so I think that's a great idea. Along those lines, another topic that you and I have been paying some attention to is this whole question of how do we install things in Tinderbox in a way that's easier. And we're on the cusp of having a version of Tinderbox that makes that far more tractable. And one of the things that I think might be helpful is to maybe have a subset of us that are interested in the problem start discussing the various approaches and see if we can converge on some standardized ways of doing things, because I think that would help everybody if there was sort of a pat way of incorporating other pieces of, or other packages, as I call them, into their documents without going through a lot of grief and aggravation. I think that's the biggest impediment to people using some of the tools that are being developed.
Well, yeah, and to that point, right? When people, like what I found with the classes I've been teaching, as excited as people are about Tinderbox and wanting to learn about Tinderbox, it's kind of an analogy I used with a friend of mine the other day. Is like, look, dude, I just want to get a plane ticket and go to Chicago. I don't want to actually know how to build the plane, right? So if we can, or fly the plane. So if we can get these installer files up and running, that lets people do a project. And then, and when they're so inclined and they can look under the hood, like a couple people have bought some of my templates recently, had a really great exchange with one gentleman, Donald, yesterday, who's, bought the template, liked the template, found some critiques, which were awesome. Some, typo king, obviously, is me. So he was able to uncover some of those, but then also use that as a means of like, I've been deconstructing your code and I don't understand your logic. Why'd you do this and why'd you do that? And that's been kind of fun, having that dialogue back and forth. And so I think things like that would be really good. Yeah, Mr. Harp, you're on mute.
No, I'm not. I sort of come to this, let's talk perhaps optimally about different ways of slicing this. One thought that I had was you open up Tinderbox and it comes with a prompt and it says, what are you interested in doing today? Or what problem you're trying to solve? And then using, sort of magical AI stuff, it will propose a journey of small modules that will help you to understand the problem, address the problem, and then you can go through those modules, or you could customize those modules to, if we get it wrong, or if they see something else that they'd like to add in among the various learning modules that they'd like to explore, they can sort of create their own journey, sort of create your own adventure. Now, is this possible? I don't know if technically we can do such a thing, but maybe we want to stay in the realm of sort of brainstorming and not be so rooted in current capabilities, and say, what would be the vision of this thing? And I'm just, sort of throwing out possible things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. And as part of that, I mean, I think I envision as part of that onboarding flow or process, right? Before we get to the nth stage, build your own journey, mind mapping thing and all that, thing, which could be a fabulous end case. I think one of the very first kind of onboarding notes that I would put into this tool, when I've got a list, I actually have prepared something I want to show you all for this, is here's an example of a bunch of end outputs you could get with Tinderbox, right? So at least at the very beginning, people can say, oh, I can do all of that. I'm like, yeah, you can, and then you can walk through some of the basics. But before we move on, Chuck.
Okay, so Steve, I like what you're suggesting. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I think having Tinderbox be its own tutorial system is kind of what you're implying, and I think it's a great idea. And Tinderbox has all these capabilities to capture and display and provide information in an organized fashion. Why not use it to help people with using Tinderbox? One issue that I think we would struggle with is that currently we don't have any good ways for code to interact with the user in Tinderbox, which is one of the oddities of Tinderbox. I mean, how can you put a question up to the user? What would you like to do next? I don't think there's a good way to do that in Tinderbox right now. So,
Yeah, so
having some means to do.
Can I interpret what
kind
you
of
just
why
said?
I said let's sort of cast aside the constraints that we currently have and sort of envision
Correct.
what the world could be. And to Michael's point, I get that there are some things that we could do today that's very concrete and would be helpful.
Yes.
I'm sort of saying that is a good thing for sort of this kind of group to work on together, but also it's good to get different perspectives on what that ultimate destination is. It's sort of the yin and yang of, this is stuff, exciting stuff we can build today using what's available, but also keep that larger vision in mind, and in some ways push the platform to try to get closer to that vision. Asking for
I agree. I agree. But yeah, and let's be careful. For today's exercise, we're not going to be able to do I don't think we'll be able to do all of that, right? There's a lot there, right? So let's just try to make sure that we can accomplish something today. Chuck, before you move on though, I liked what you said. We don't have a way of something for code to interact with the user. I didn't get the exact word, but so what, and I've heard you say this before. Are you referring to like dialog boxes that can pop up and that you can fill in a field and interact with?
Yeah, I mean, it's that simple. I mean, it's one of my biggest frustrations with Tinderbox is I'm writing, you're focusing on an output. I'm focusing more on input. How do you bring things into Tinderbox and organize them? And in many instances, I get to the point where I would like to be able to have the user make a decision based on information that Tinderbox has collected. And I don't
Yeah.
have any way to present that. So I have to go find ways to put a bunch of checkboxes somewhere so people can pre-configure what they want to have happen. But if you don't know what's going to happen until you've done, let's say, an import of a whole bunch of data, how do you get to that? If you run into unexpected conditions, how do you tell a user, I can't proceed because something here isn't right? And engage the customer, the user in making the decision as to how do you get out of that mess, or at
Yeah,
least,
and I've found some ways around that using show. Like,
yeah. But
hey,
show is
this variable is not
output.
populated. You need to put it in
There's no
there.
right. There's no back from the user with show. It's a one
Right, that's the
way.
problem. So, right, so the problem would be in that context, like I'd say, hey, this variable needs to have a value. Wouldn't it be nice though if they could actually type that value in?
Right.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mr. Anderson.
So yeah, Mr. Anderson, what do you think about this? Somebody must have pointed this out to you before, and
So suffice to say, it won't surprise you that I do have some thoughts on this, because
Really?
we've been playing this game for 20 odd years, and I certainly made some demos under the original Tinderbox system. It was hard and gory, but they worked. I think I'll make a couple of points. One is, I think we really need to understand how far the app and the environment has moved since it was designed originally.
Yep.
No design choice is without opinion, whether deliberate or not. And were one making this same tool today, one might start from a different place. So the sort of the real core of Tinderbox drew from StorySpace, which was a hypertext tool where you actually wrote and read the thing in the same tool. It was before the web. Didn't really know, things weren't networked. You put a floppy in and you read the story kind of thing. And the innovation in a way that came with Tinderbox is those of us who were playing the game around the turn of the millennium, blogging was a thing. But blogging, then you were writing static web pages. So if you look carefully at Tinderbox, that's what it does. And there's no harm in that. And indeed, I see a few hands up, it still does. And, if only blogging came back again, but the world took a different turn. The reason I say this is that I think there are two problems we face. One is that people come along and they see some of the more complicated things. I use that word advisedly, but they see some richer things that people produce. They say, I want that. Understandably. So where's the make that button? And in a way, that's sort of what Chuck's discussing. I mean, Chuck and Michael have done some amazing work recently with libraries and trying to sort of share that sort of complexity in a document with people easily. The other thing that came across to me is that everyone sees what they want to see in the app. I saw a comment, so someone saying, but it's an outline. I said, well, no, it's not. Tinderbox has an outline view, one view spec of 8. And part of the thing is, if you don't grok that underneath whatever view you're looking at lies some data. Now, I know it's stored as an outliner, but that doesn't mean it was written as an outliner. It was written as a note-taking tool. You can open a Tinderbox document and put 1,000 notes in it, all effectively in one container, in one map, so to speak. Probably not the best way to do things, but it's perfectly possible. And I make the point simply that one of the problems is that, and I think I do think the arrival of the Markdown Brigade about 3 years ago was a very good case in point. A lot of people who, for all sorts of understandable reasons, knew no better than a world viewed through the lens of Markdown, and they were very, very angry that Tinderbox was not written ground up using Markdown, because that's clearly how the world is. And they would tell us in very forthright terms that we were doing it wrong, because I think this. And I take that on board, because in a way they're not wrong, but Tinderbox is something richer. So one of the problems is that when you onboard what are you trying to show people? Because they're all actually doing quite different things. Mark wrote a very eloquent piece actually on the backstage. Sorry for those who haven't seen it.
I like my favorite one was, I'm not an idiot.
In a very measured terms, said, you know, get up a bit, you know, not a complete idiot. And I know his, and I see the problem there, which is, well, what are you trying to get them to do? So, for instance, for the flip side of it is, if I'm someone who's never used any of this before and I just want to do cool stuff, I just want to know which box to put my words in and which button to press to make the magic happen. And yet that is just not how Tinderbox used properly works. You actually do some work, you think about what you want, and you go build most of it. And you go build most of it because if you wanted a push button thing, 90% of people would say, that's fine, but I didn't want that. I wanted something different. How do I customize it? So in a sense, Tinderbox distills that. But this makes it very difficult to bridge the onboarding gap. So for instance, one of the things that doesn't easily come out of the sort of simple explanation is, if you get prototypes and what they do and you get inheritance, I think you unlock a lot quickly. Now, if you have no background in computer science and you've never done any sort of coding or scripting, that's all a bit weird. Conceptually, you understand it. Someone describes it, you say, yeah, marvelous, I do this and that changes. But you need, and I sort of watched this with people learning along the way, getting to the point where you understand, aha, right, I can make something and I can make all these things different or not, essentially at the touch of a button, at the change of an attribute. I think is actually the thing to try and help people with, rather than say, oh, you want to do a bit of outlining, here's how you do outlining in Tinderbox. Because what actually happens is that it reinforces a misconception that this is a one-trick pony. And people are right, if that is their conception of what the tool is, to think, well, this isn't very good, you know, I got this other app and it only cost me 99 cents and look, it does this. But it's comparing apples and pears. So I think it's quite a subtle task. I think, you know, what Michael's proposed, I think is good. I'll hold my powder dry as to whether it necessarily bridges the gap. Not because of wrong intent, but simply because of the nature of the task involved. I mean, it's really interesting, for instance, that Chuck has described that he's looking at stuff like import, as opposed to, say, creation broadly for export. And in fact, I almost wrote a small reply to Mark's PM, and I thought it might sound like a correction. But one of the things, for instance, I've noticed is, I don't think most people do what he described, is open the app, make a few notes, fiddle around a bit, make a few more notes. No, actually, a lot of people sort of take a bunch of stuff, stick it in there, know that what the output they want is. And most of the things they're used to using condition them to the sense that essentially they're fighting the application to find the button that's stopping them doing the thing that they can't describe, but which they want. Now, we know, because all of us have sort of done that in one way or another, then a bit more reflection is needed. So the question is how we help people to understand that the tool is not just a insert category.
Yeah, for me too, a big part of
multiple views have real scope and real power and real intent. And you don't have to use them all, but even the idea that you can look at the same information in more than one way. It's really interesting when I stopped to sort of concentrate on that when sort of helping people. That's one of those sort of moments of, oh, right, so it's just the same stuff underneath. So if we can find ways to help people with that, it's not what they'll ask. It definitely isn't what they'll ask for. But I think actually, if you give them that, I think it makes it a lot easier for them to start getting some power out. And I see hands up, so I'll shut up now.
Yeah, real quick, I want to make a couple comments on that. One is, you know, I had one of my students yesterday in the cohort 3 had a breakthrough, because we were in the 5th week of the class and we were working through on how to you know, basically how to work with media in Tinderbox, how to work with images. And I started getting really granular. I'm like, look, you can copy and paste an image into a note, not a problem. But and you can put text around that note, not a problem. One of the challenges of doing that, though, is you start intermixing content and images and all of this. So let's then think about attributes and what they mean, and think about the path of an image. And we methodically went through the process of breaking down, to your point, all of the inputs. What are the inputs we have here? An input, that is, it's an image. An input is that it has a path. It's input that is that there's a file name for this image. And then you have other inputs, the width of the image, the height of the image. And if you start breaking down all those elements into attributes, you can decide how far you want to break it down, or do you just want to keep the entire path as one string? And we methodically walked that through with them. And then I said, now let's go look at a template, and using export code, start incrementally putting those pieces together. And so we started with, here's a long string of paths of information about here's the HTML string to publish an image. That's where we started. Caret image source equals alt width equals all that. And I said, let's now methodically break this thing into its attribute values, and then using templates, reassemble it. And it took us about an hour and a half to go through that process. And he emailed me last night saying, oh my God, it just clicked, right? I just figured it out, because inputs come in, process happens in the middle. And the great thing about Tinderbox is the emperor has no clothes. You can actually see the process happening for the most part. And then you get an output. And I think it's that kind of methodical training that, I've done this cohort 3 times, that I finally kind of figured out how to share some of the stuff. But I want to get to our exercise together. Dave Rogers, go ahead.
So a couple notes briefly. The first, Tinderbox has a very robust AppleScript dictionary that makes, I think, nearly all of the application accessible to a user to create. Essentially, you could do one of 2 things. You could actually have an AppleScript application that you launch, and that will then create a Tinderbox document with all the containers and all the attributes that you want in your default document. And in that Tinderbox application, you can ask the user for, what they want to, what tags do you want to include, you can interact with the user through AppleScript and create objects.
Good point.
In Tinderbox. The second, I think, cognitive load on Tinderbox, and one that persists with me to this day, because I've been using Tinderbox since it was version 1, is, and in version 1, preview did not exist, as I recall. I have never regarded preview as a first-class citizen in Tinderbox, but more and more it seems as though preview is driving the train. That it is, like Chuck was referring to, it is an output of an external file that is the raison d'etre for Tinderbox. I have never felt that way. I felt it was a content management system for me to kind of manage my thoughts, notes, and everything. Yeah, it output an HTML file, and that's what I use for my blog. But the marmot is the Tinderbox file that belongs to me. The part that I share is secondary. It's why I do it, but I mean, it's not the main thing I use. So it's interesting how, to me, how preview mode has sort of taken over, and export code has taken over much of the application. And I don't know if many people feel the same way, but that is a bit of cognitive dissonance with me.
Honestly, I don't think it has. I think it's gotten a lot more attention, possibly because of my fault. But that was part of the argument that Mark Bernstein was making in the backstage, though. He's saying this is such a robust tool, and you've got these things called attributes, and I don't remember the exact language he had, but you have action attributes, you have action code that lets you action against those values and those variables. You've got all of these different mechanics that you can use to manipulate and manage your inputs and outputs, and that's what makes this tool really, really special. For me, Dave, one of the things that's important for me, though, is one of the modules I'm teaching or developing is calling Teaching in Tinderbox. And I'm about a month or 2 away of actually not needing PowerPoint ever again to teach my classes. Like I will teach my class by opening up preview and walking through the notes in Tinderbox. And then I can export out of Tinderbox and paste that presentation up into the learning management system at the school. So there's a lot of value in in that. But Chuck, and then if you don't mind, then I want to share my screen real quick.
Yeah. No, just quickly, I want to comment sort of on the thread that Mark started when he talked about, bringing in all this stuff that, and in some respects, yes, there has been a shift toward leveraging Tinderbox as a way to produce output. And Michael, you've kind of driven that train. And I think it's very interesting. And I know that down the road, that's going to be very important to me. I understand the value you get from being able to get rid of PowerPoint. Boy, I would love to do the same. But the other side of it, though, is, and I think we need to recognize that this is one of the potential, game-changing capabilities of Tinderbox, is that all of us confront problem spaces where there is a tremendous amount of existing information. It might be, whole databases that people want to parse and make sense of. And the world is like never before full of tons of information, vast quantities of information. And it's largely inaccessible because we don't have tools to get in and analyze and manipulate that. And of course, the AI crowd would say, oh, just don't worry about it. AI will solve this problem. BS. I don't think so. And what makes Tinderbox very interesting to me is I can take a specialized area where I've got a wealth of information and I can bring it into a tool that allows me to analyze that information, create notes about that information, assemble things into a more logical structure. And I think that's extremely powerful. Then if on the flip side, we can also do the output, we can turn around and take that information we've collated and assessed and analyzed and produce it back. That's kind of what research and contribution to society is all about. Doing
Yeah. Yeah. And there really is no other tool like that. So let me do a favor. Let's start our dialogue. So we've got an hour now. Let's go through and see what we can accomplish with this. So I want to start with a file I've created to walk us through some dialogue. So maybe give me 5-7 minutes to talk about that. And then let's open up a new Tinderbox file and start brainstorming. And we can edit along the way too, if you guys are inclined with that. So I've got this is something I just threw together. Where are you all at? So generally, when I think about some of the core onboarding concepts, it's like, this idea of, there's some general concepts, input versus output software. I refer to like Word and Excel as output software. All the content, appearance, structure all gets combined together. Input software is exactly what Tom's talking about. Break it all into its little pieces and then let the tool help you do it. This idea of incremental formalization from Shipman and Marshall and Shipman, this idea of letting your knowledge incrementally improve over time, metacognition, learning how your brain works, managing inputs and outputs. And then you have some core ideas. Like one was, create a note or import a note, right? So in other words, get stuff in. And then another concept I would throw out there is get stuff out while I'm talking about this, right? And then do something to stuff. Right. So these three things might be the core aspect of the onboarding. Get stuff in, do something with stuff, get stuff out. Then you've got these other concepts, attributes, and all that. Now, going to Steve's comment, well, once you kind of generally approach this tool, what can you do with Tinderbox? Well, you can think and understand. You can produce any number of different types of academic work. You can produce a whole variety of other types of writing and publishing work. You can do any number of different types of business and productivity processes. You can do technology and data analysis management. You can do your own personal knowledge management. You can teach with Tinderbox, and you can do a bunch of other stuff too, policy making and all that. So, that's part of the challenge, Steve, when we think about, well, what can you do with Tinderbox? You can kind of do anything. When it comes to personal knowledge, when it comes to just general knowledge management, at some level, outside of the collaboration issue, which I think is Chuck and I have talked about this at length, how do we collaborate not just with other people, but with our future selves using this tool? We've got some issues. Yeah, go ahead, Chuck.
So very quickly, teaching. I think maybe that's the one to really focus on, because if we can work on how to make Tinderbox a better tool for learning about Tinderbox, I think we'll start solving some of the other problems that are on your list. It's a large list.
Yeah.
And it just feels to me like teaching is, in a sense, what we're all trying to do one way or another, including teaching ourselves. So
no, exactly.
If we could focus on how can we improve Tinderbox's ability to support learning, and we can start with learning about Tinderbox, I think that begins to move us in some useful directions.
No, I agree. I love it. All right. So let me move on before we so the next thing I started to think about, and this is what in particularly excites me the most about this tool, and I kind of referred to it a couple of times, is the emperor has no clothes, in the sense that what Tinderbox has helped me learn and understand and appreciate it's ripped off the Wizard of Oz curtain to let me see really what's going behind the scenes in computing, and what's really going behind the scenes in standardization, and what's really been going behind the scenes in the way we think. And I started brainstorming all, in my, birthday's tomorrow. So in my 50 plus 6 years, everything sorry, my box went out. Everything that I've learned along the way, what I've learned in the previous 10 years before finally truly learning how to use Tinderbox, and then what I've really learned in the last 5 years as I've really jumped into Tinderbox, I started thinking about, well, what are all of those concepts that I've learned? And so I started breaking that down and built this concept model. And this is just a total hack. But we have types of knowledge, we have mental constructs, we have visualization methods, we have digital information languages and formats, we have data formats and types, we have Tinderbox capabilities itself, we have various PKM methods. And I actually have one file that I've built that has about 57 PKM methods going back to the 1600s. That shows, like, so this idea of knowledge management that we've been trying to figure out has been a problem for a few hundred years. It's not, or hundreds of years. And so there's a really interesting file I can share on that kind of looks at the different methods. And then you have various document formats. You have various channels to which that information is presented and delivered. You have the ecosystem of apps. Tinderbox is not an app that exists for itself. It's not the one ring that rules them all. Although for me, it is the ring that sits in the center. But yet, to really get the most out of it, I use a whole suite of other productivity tools and plugins and services that help me leverage this. And then you have a variety of different coding conventions. And not that everyone needs to learn all of this to properly use this tool, but I think this is what kind of confounds people when they come to Tinderbox, because this is what Tinderbox gives you. It opens up this entire world of computing and data manipulation and data management, unlike any other tool that I've ever come across. So let me, and just talking about like the visualizations, these are all because the other thing that I want to kind of emphasize, and so Dave Rogers made this comment about preview. What fascinates me about Tinderbox so much is, yes, you have your 10 internal views, but because of templating, you can build any, like the table view that I just developed this week. You can build your own views with Tinderbox. You don't even think about exporting. Think about building your own views so you can look at your data. And I'll just, just before just let me kind of demonstrate what I mean by that real quick, and then I'll move on. So this is the new file that I'll be launching later today. But if you look at, and this is an example of, I've got data. So I've got a list of notes. and those notes have attribute values. And as we were just talking about before, you can use Tinderbox to take these inputs, move them around, and then display them in any way you want, regardless of whether or not they are being quote unquote exported. But preview is essentially a view of export. And Chuck, I'll give me 30 seconds and I'll have you talk. So I'm looking at this, I'm looking at these notes now, and I'm saying, okay, well, what do I want to do with these notes? Well, I want to look at them as a Word document. So there's a linear view of the document. Well, now what do I want to do? Well, now I want to look at them as a list. Okay. And I've got to turn off these. So now I'm looking them as a list. And then I'm like, okay, well, you know what I really want to do is I want to look at them as a table. And so you can actually produce your own views. And then if you don't want to make that view, I've got another file that I could share with everyone where I found about 30 visualization libraries out there. And if you understand this idea, and that's what Mark is doing with this concept of posters, that if you grok the idea of attribute values and the fact that you can pass these values not only to your own templates, but you can pass these values to visualization libraries, you can leverage other people's JavaScript visualization libraries to really do any visualization of any of your data in any way you want. And that's one of the core values that I've had. And again, and just to, if you want, you can actually put all of these views. Sorry, you can put all of these views all in the same document. Here's my linear view, here's my list view, and here's my table view, looking at the same underlying data. So that's the power of what I think with Tinderbox. And I know, and I get this is super overwhelming, but again, that's part of the reason, that's both the power and the challenge of Tinderbox, is it does make all of this possible. Chuck.
So I agree. That's very impressive and it's a wonderful capability. The thing that I wanted to come to emphasize, though, is that to a certain extent, this is still one-way communications. So the other facility within Tinderbox that I think has tremendous value is the table view. And
Yep.
one of the advantages of it is you can present a table, and tables are very powerful ways to organize information. That table is based on the notes in your document, but you can then go into the table and edit the fields and make changes.
Yes, correct.
And that's trying to get to the point where the beautiful displaying you're able to do of tables built from notes, have that be more interactive. And I realize that's a challenge. And part of the problem with the table view is it's got its own constraints. It isn't pretty. It doesn't have as many bells and whistles, or some of that is a little bit more difficult for people to play around with. But still, it's a very powerful capability because it allows editing. And I think thinking more through how to have the ability to interact with your data once you've got it in a format that is useful is
Correct.
Perhaps one of the challenges. And don't have any answers to it. I'm just saying I think it's one of the things to think about.
Yeah, and just so people can, people that may not be aware of what we're referring to when we say table view that are watching this video. Oops, come on. All right, so there's a file that I produced that shows here's a list of companies, and here's a list of data about those companies. And this file, and I think that's one of the challenges that people have with Tinderbox too, is they're like, well, why doesn't hyperbolic work for me? Well, because you've got to get the data, you have to have the appropriate amount of data for that view to become realized. So that's what I was doing with that. So if I look here, what Chuck's referring to is this. So I've got a list of notes, and this is looking at outline view. And then I could easily then go look at those notes in map view. I could look at those notes then in table view, and what table view then allows me to go and edit these values. And I think this is part of that incremental formalization point that I was saying, thinking through, Chuck. It's like, yeah, when you're working on your data, use table view, absolutely. But then when you're getting ready to publish, or you're getting ready to, hey, now I've worked on this, I've refined it, I've previewed it, now I want to present it as to my students, or I want to copy this and drop it into a Google Doc, or somehow get it out. that's where that's what I would, to your point at the beginning of the call, you're saying I'm working on output, you're working on input. There's that middle part, which I think is where Tinderbox also incredibly excels, is that incrementally thinking capability.
Yeah.
But
So-
that's that view that you were talking about.
Right. So coming back to what we were talking about earlier, I think a lot of people have difficulty understanding what you're doing with tables versus this internal
Correct.
table presentation method. And so that comes back to the kind of thing that we'd like to figure out how to make it easier for people to learn when to use which feature and under what circumstances, and why one mechanism is more useful for this purpose versus another mechanism might be more useful for some other purpose, like publishing.
And remember too, there invariably in Tinderbox, because it is so flexible, there isn't one mechanism. If there's one way to do something, there's probably 10. Right. And then that's just your approach or your method or the way your brain works. There's a right, and no one method is better than the other necessarily. I mean, there's some optimal ways, but sometimes you just need to get the job done, and it doesn't matter how optimal it is.
Right. And because of that richness, a lot of people have troubles getting their head around, so where do I go? It's like being dropped in the middle of the Amazon forest and say, there's all kinds of interesting stuff here. Where do I go without getting bitten by the snake?
Right. And if I do get bitten by the snake, is it one that's going to kill me or one that's just going to hurt? That's the other issue. Yeah, Mark.
I'm thinking, listening to this, is one thing that perhaps we're blowing past quite quickly is the fact that for a lot of people, they're starting in a different place. I'm working with a number of people who are mainly in the sort of digital humanities, and one of the things I'm really noticing is that to me, it's always a sense that text is always sacrosanct. So this kind of thing, I have to, if I can't see the text on the screen, it doesn't exist. So people are producing sort of items with massive labels, and that I'm thinking that's a bit odd. Why don't you just make that one a blue circle and that one a red triangle? They look at you as if you've gone bonkers. But it just shows that the abstraction that is useful if it's explained to you is absolutely totally unintuitive for a lot of people within the sort of perspective they come to. So, and I know we discussed this, but it's one thing to sort of say, well, you can take all the stuff you're doing and you make these attributes to do this, that, the other, but you blasted past, for them, almost the sort of the credo breaking step is to take the text and start doing this abstraction. Because those people tend to have a note that will have maybe a paragraph of source text in it, and what they're doing in the digital sense is something you would have done on paper, except they're not actually drawing on the text. Now, and there's no right or wrong in this, but again, it's something to just bear in mind in terms of the onboarding. That I think is quite a common way that people come at things. So they're taking text, they're dismantling it, but normally in the context of making one note into a series of small notes. So they'll get stuff like explode, because see that. But as those of us who sort of noodle a bit more know that there's much power to be offered by appropriate use of attributes, partly because it's this thing that if you want to display something or you want to export it in a nuanced way, you need to be able to address it. And so one of the key things to get across to people early is that it's fine. You can put a whole essay into the text of a note, and you can read it, but your ability to do much with it is actually remarkably little, because everything you do requires you to do something which, God forbid, is another gnarly regex, which is a world of pain in itself. Rather than the sense of it's sort of gently training yourself to say, oh right, there are things in here that I know I want, and I want to come back to and have special meaning for me. If I do this weird and odd thing of putting it in a different box on the screen, an attribute, as a displayed attribute, because this is another thing I think we blow past, is that if you watch carefully, for a lot of people starting out, attributes are the things above the text on the right-hand side of the screen. The fact
they don't realize that every note has every attribute associated with it, and the values exist whether or not they're visually there or not.
Yes, but that's a sort of structural understanding of it. It's more the sense that if I can't see it, it isn't there. So you know, I've had conversations with somebody which are along the lines of, but I did this, but it's gone now. And what it turned out is they deleted that line from the displayed attributes. And in their understanding of things, which is entirely right from where they were, from where they are in present, is that, yeah, it has gone. And it's gone because it's not visible. But this goes back to the point of, I think a thing to help people understand is that just because you can't see it all the time doesn't mean it isn't there. I think that's a really powerful thing to help unlock, because until you know that, there are lots of other ways you can do things. You can get through lots of work and do stuff. But if you haven't encountered that, it's something you're not going to guess. You'll just see other people doing weird stuff you don't get. So this is one of the bridging metaphors I think I think we would do well to help people encourage. And when I look back to the sort of the onboarding doc such as was written, it's sort of there, but actually I don't think it's explicit enough. It'll say, well, we can do this, let's make an attribute. Yeah. That's actually, I think, a massive step that needs a lot more explanation for a goodly number of people.
Well, and I think what we can do now when we talk about our onboarding is when we think about those steps, and now that we have notification and show, and we have the ability to, you know, we could actually, I'm envisioning, almost like this step-by-step tutorial that says, do this, now check this box, now do this, now check this box. And you can actually walk them through the steps of creating an attribute. And having some text in there that explains this is what an attribute is, this is why it matters. And I love your quote, if you love it, put a ring on it. If you love it, put an attribute on it. If that information is of value to you, separate it out and stick it into an attribute so you can use it later. I think that kind of methodical exercise I would think would be useful. And I also think if we can find a way, to Chuck's point earlier, teaching with Tinderbox, if we can find a way to actually use an androgyny or endogeny, not pedagogy, the ability to instruct people to do something, like go do this. So they're actually having to physically do something to learn it, I think would be helpful.
I got one more quick one to throw in, and that is a lot of things are quite alien. So there's all too often when people say, well, it's not, you're doing something I don't understand. And some people need a bit more hand-holding in that to understand that, okay, well, you're going to make a thing about a subject that's different to yours, but that's not what you're doing. You're not doing it because it's about geography or it's about, I don't know, medieval shoe menders in Koblenz. The exercise is to understand this part of the application. That's one thing. The other is that, no, carry on. It's flown from my mind. I shall circle back.
Yeah, I love the comment that Roger just put in the text, though. He says the thing with abstraction is that you have to anchor it to something concrete you already understand, or to the other anchored abstractions you already know. The challenge of getting someone to understand a new abstraction when there is nothing available to anchor to. And going back to the teaching point that Chuck raised, is that's exactly what we do as teachers. We say we start with a learning outcome. And I think that's what I like us to see what we want to, in the last 40 minutes or so. Let's start the exercise with what are, for the onboarding, what are the 4 or 5, no more, learning outcomes for an initial exposure onboarding. And then you scaffold it back, right? What assets do we need and what exercises do we need to be able to achieve those learning outcomes? And then how do we assess that they've learned them? And that's teaching. And I think if we can start with those outcomes, that would be really good.
I quickly remember what the other point, which is probably summarized by the cry from the backseat, are we there yet? Which is all too often when faced with something new, what we actually do is we run a delta on, is it what I want? So you think of all the threads that start in the forum, so this is rubbish. I pressed the button and I got the wrong answer. Is essentially what the people are saying. And I get it, because what they're doing is that I imagined this thing, I did what I thought was necessary, and I didn't get what I wanted. Okay, fine, no sin there. But I think it's worth bearing in mind because what you just mentioned is the question is, are you going to be able to carry people that far? Because if your starting sort of approach is, are we there yet? What that does is it means you're never concentrating on what you're being told because you're so busy working out whether you've got what you want. You don't actually listen to the instructions again. I mean, it shouldn't be that, but we all do it, and I think that's worth bearing in mind in sort of construction. We get another thing people don't read,
and that was one of the failure. And here's one of the challenges, and that I've been trying to figure out in doing my cohort. So in cohort number 2, I had a student super irate, like, you're talking to me about attributes, you're talking to me about thises and that's, and just show me how to write my paper, right? Get me to the end state. And then and then again, unfortunately, I reacted to them and I started talking about the end state, but then that pissed everyone else off because they're like, yeah, but we're not learning the fundamentals. And so how do you balance this discussion between here's an end state, AKA learning objective, learning outcomes or output, with, these inputs that we need, and it reflect on, and it's my best teacher I've ever had in my entire life, or one of my best. I've had 4 or 5 really good ones, but it was Mr. Gordon Janowski, sophomore year of high school, chemistry professor, and he walked in, put his coffee down on the table, looked at us all on day 1, and said, "I'm going to spend the next 9 months lying to you because you're all too stupid to actually, you don't have enough information and enough foundational knowledge to really understand chemistry. So I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of stuff, and you're going to think at the end of 9 months that you know chemistry, and you don't, because all I'm doing right now for you for the next 9 months is terminology that in the real world actually is not true. But I'm needing to abstract it up to these higher level ideas so much so that when you actually put them into practical application, they don't work. There's more work after these basics that you'd have to do to really understand chemistry." And I just love that a teacher was telling me that he's going to lie to me for the next 9 months. It was awesome. But I think that kind of understanding that we need to help people get to, I think, is critical. Yeah, Chuck.
Yeah, so kind of along those lines, I think when we start talking about teaching, one of the potential benefits of Tinderbox is self-learning. And I think we want to emphasize Tinderbox is a tool for an individual to use. And so if we want to talk about learning, we want to talk about Tinderbox helping someone learn on their own or learn by exploration of the capabilities that they direct. Where do they want to go? And so I think that's part of the challenge, is not thinking in terms of a traditional course where you learn this, then you learn this, then you learn this. But if we really believe in the hypertext model, why can't people approach the subject? In this case, I'm saying the subject is Tinderbox itself, and you explore that subject area in the way that makes sense to them. Yeah. And I think that's the real challenge. Can we achieve that goal? Can we meet that objective? And then have people feedback and perhaps enhance the process because they learned, when I went down that path, I didn't get what I needed. And maybe they contribute to providing that path, or they advise others, this is an area I could have used some help.
Well, and that's where the science comes in too. It's like, what was Einstein saying? I failed 1,000 times to build the first light bulb, right? It's, not getting the action code right first time doesn't mean you failed. It just means that experiment didn't work.
I think you meant Edison.
Or Edison, yeah. That experiment didn't work, right? And I think that's part of that learning process. And I just love watching Bruce's journey, along with me. I mean, remember our first session 4.5 years ago when we were like, what's a prototype? And look how far we've come, and we've finally gotten Bruce converted into like writing his book. And not only is he learning Tinderbox in the process, he's learning about the history of his relationship with his brother and what's made him human and where he's at. And it's pretty exciting watching that journey happen. You came off mute, Bruce. You want to comment?
Yeah, no, I'm there. In fact, here's a very brief aside as I'm sort of learning thanks to Tinderbox. So there's a famous fashion photographer named Dennis Peale, and he currently has a show in New York. I happened to come across it and was beyond, because my brother and Dennis Peele knew one another. The part of the book is how my brother destroyed Dennis Peele's apartment and his 15th century table, and how they two of them remained friends afterwards. And so my point of that is, had it not been for a timeline that I was putting together in Tinderbox and then wanting to research certain things, I never would have come across that. So one of the things that's happening, and I realize this is a little bit sideways,
Not
but
at all.
as
That's
I'm
perfect.
using Tinderbox, forcing is the wrong word. It's creating opportunities and motivation for me to search for things in ways that I would not normally have done so. And by doing so, I find myself with new pieces of information that, of course, I put back into Tinderbox.
Mhm. Yeah, Dave. Yeah, that's awesome. Fantastic. Your hand's been up.
So I wondered to what extent some of the feedback that Mark Bernstein gets regarding Tinderbox and its perceived level of complexity comes from the sort of fashion sense of the tech world, that uh, people hear some buzz about Tinderbox. You know, Obsidian was the hotness, Rome was the hotness. People look at people say, well, Tinderbox does this, and so people come at it to look at it as an artifact, as an object, and to determine if mastering it or owning it is somehow reflects on their hipness as a member of the tech community. I don't think many, I suspect many of the people that uh, not, and this is not to diminish the input of people who are actually trying to master the application. I think a lot of them are dilettantes in that sense, in that they want to, grok Tinderbox immediately and, categorize it as, okay, this is Obsidian, or this is Rome, or this is a mind mapper, or this is the brain, or whatever, and then put it in their collection of cool apps that they can talk about and post YouTube videos on and get their hipster creds validated. Um, I think the key thing with
There was a
Tinder,
lot. There was a lot there, Dave.
well, what I'm saying, the point is that you have to want to make something. If you want to learn Tinderbox, you have to commit the time and effort to do it. So you have to have some thing in life that you want to do. For me, it was the blog, but now it's for Captain's Log and other things. But you have to have something you want to make, and Tinderbox is your tool. If you're just a dilettante, there's no amount of dumbing down the interface that we can do to make Tinderbox appealing to that kind of person.
I do want to challenge you a little bit on that, though, and I think that's where
Sure.
we as a community can make a difference. I think fundamentally, you're absolutely right. However, with the installer work and the tables and templates, like I've got now my foundational template, my list template, my table template, and a media one I'm going to release next week. And I had an academic that reached out to me last week, said, I'm really struggling. I'm so tired of this whole plethora of tools. I want that centralized tool, which is Tinderbox. And literally within an hour, I handed him over the 3 files. We hopped up on a Zoom. He installed those files and started writing an article. And he had the ability to publish it to Pandoc and into Word. So he didn't need to know any of the Tinderbox stuff to be able to produce output that he needed to produce and to be able to think with the tool, because he trusted, ideally, he trusted in the process, he trusted in me, he trusted in the files, he trusted that they're going to work. And he was able to validate that within an hour. And so I think if we
But he
can do
didn't learn
more of that
anything about
contribution.
Tinderbox.
What?
He didn't learn anything about
Well,
Tinderbox.
he did. Well, he did.
No,
That
you
was part of
gave
my
him
training.
you gave him a turnkey solution. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with that.
But
See,
but
I think people look at note-taking applications kind of like they look at photos or Lightroom or something, where they're mainly a collection container where you can organize into albums or you can make slideshows or whatever, and you can do some light editing and stuff. But the real work is in making the photograph, if it's worth keeping, And it, you know, you have to look at Tinderbox as the camera, not the Lightroom application.
Hmm.
So what you gave them was Lightroom, it sounded like to me. But
No, but what I gave them, but the difference with Tinderbox, unlike other tools, is when you're ready, you can start opening up the hood. Go look at that stamp. Go look at that template. Go see how and that's where the education comes into play. And so I think that's part of the challenge of why people give up with Tinderbox is they want to get that paper, they want to get that output done, but it takes too much time to actually get something productive done. So if I can start with some templates to let them get something productive done and then teach them, let them incrementally teach themselves along the way on how to do it themselves, that's where I've found success.
okay, well, okay.
Yeah, no, but I do see your point though too. But I see this all the time though. People give up because it's just when they say Tinderbox is too hard, it's because they can't get past that just inputting in some notes. They can't get past figuring out how to do
I'd
something.
like to learn to play the piano one day. If that were really true, I'd know how to play the piano. So it's same thing with Tinderbox. So
Yeah, Steve. Good points.
There's an opinion piece by David Brooks in the New York Times today called "A Surprising Route to the Best Life Possible." And it really intersects a lot of what Dave has been talking about. And that is both there are sort of a certain set of people who tackle very hard things, and they continue to persist in pursuing those hard things because they get a whole lot of joy about being able to solve those problems. I would say, to sum up, Tinderbox is not for everybody, and it's not for every problem, because the investment required both in time, and frankly, it's not the cheapest piece of software around. It's not for everybody. It's not for every problem. But for some people who have both the passion to pursue it and problems that Tinderbox can be applied to and really might be the only tool available, it's perfect.
Well, and on that same note too, like neurodiversity models too, I spent 10 plus years looking for a tool that worked with the way my brain worked. Right. And there's no other, being forced into linear writing in Word just meant that I never could write. And once I found Tinderbox, I actually learned that I actually can write, just not linearly. Yeah, it's very, very, very enlightening. Cool.
Read the article.
Yeah, can you
Yeah.
put a link in the note
I can.
in the chat?
It's unfortunately behind a paywall, so unless you're a subscriber, I'm not
Or
going
you've
to.
got access to academic databases.
I'm not going to gift it to everybody. But it really intersects a lot of some of the comments that have been made recently, especially by Dave.
Nice. Looks like I got access to the full article just by clicking on it.
Cool.
Nice. All right. No, I agree. That's really cool. And any other? Do we want to? We've got about 25 minutes left. Do we want to open up a Tinderbox file and start brainstorming like what we think some of the learning objectives might be, what some of the steps might be? How would you all like to take the next step? Like maybe we start with map view and start, I don't know, documenting some of this. Thoughts?
How about
Chuck,
starting with just putting down some objectives around, figuring out what it is that people want to do when they approach Tinderbox.
Yes,
I think maybe just writing down some objectives and not even thinking necessarily much about how we do it, but just
exactly.
What are we trying to accomplish? Where are we trying to help people go?
Yep. So let's start with that. And we'll throw up an adornment. Okay. So we've got some learning objective box out here, and shoot, who wants to start? Create a note. Just brainstorming here. What else? Don't all throw out anything at once.
Well, I think one of the objectives is navigation.
Okay.
So Tinderbox has some amazing ways to navigate yourself to various things, to find that attribute that you associated with that note and put it in some context. And I think that navigation is one of the areas a lot of people run into problems. So helping people just deal with navigating. You know, I'm here. I want that information in that attribute that's associated with that note way over there. How do I get to it?
How do I discover my information? How do I discover my notes, values, and attributes? Like, we can refine this language to even make it simpler down the. So I'm hearing, and this is kind of two different concepts: navigation versus find. I think are some two different interesting concepts. Higher level task from Steve: structure the content for delivery. Okay. Set of classes. Yeah, for sure. There definitely going to be some structuring. Higher level tasks there. Let me drop that in. Okay. Anybody else? Bruce, what would you throw out? You're on mute. Anybody else?
Shall I hop in while Bruce says finally the on switch?
Finding the on, yeah.
There we go. But go ahead,
Bruce,
Mark.
go ahead.
I'll go after you.
No, Bruce, far away.
So, by the way, you caught me. I was trying to find a simple piece for Dave Rogers to be able to play as time goes by. And I had just found it when you called on me.
I could do the melody line.
Well, you know, it's interesting on that note that you didn't mean that you know, because it's slow, and the biggest challenge is the nuances. You can learn it. All right. So what do you want me to throw in, Michael? I am so
I don't
sorry.
know. What do we need to learn? Like, if we were going to onboard a brand new person into Tinderbox, what is it that we think they would need to learn?
Well, how to structure different sections.
Okay.
At least that's my challenge. You know, it isn't just how do I navigate my notes, but how do I organize my notes? I was thinking about that a little earlier because I want to create a timeline of certain things, but I'm not quite sure. Should I have the timeline be separate? It's that old thing. Should I have the timeline just be embedded and then just try and pick up only those attributes?
Okay. Okay. Just taking off of
I almost wish that I could kind of follow along Chuck and Dave and Mark Anderson and others and kind of watch them start from scratch with an idea and see what they do, because I am certain each of you have different methodologies, but all of them are likely successful. And that's really, for me, it isn't so much a series of templates. I really like the understanding, but it's a matter of having enough of a toolkit, enough of a toolkit along with the understanding of Tinderbox to then be able to you know, to put it together. My downfall every single time is action code. I spend an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out what I want and how to make it happen.
But you can do a lot without ever touching action code or exporting.
Well, now you know my secret.
Um, and I say that, I should push back a little bit on it, because the on add action is action code, and that's kind of the most fundamental thing, I think. When you talk about hierarchy and inheritance, you get some confusion in there because we use a genealogical sort of description of containers as parents, grandparents, children, siblings, and so on. And then you talk about inheritance, and you think a child inherits something from its parent. It does not inherit something from its prototype. So you have to early on sort of break that connection between genetics and genealogy metaphors that we use in computers, so that they understand what a prototype is and what the value of a prototype is, and then how you can leverage that value, and then using agents and a little bit of action code in the on add action to assign a prototype to a particular note in that container. So
the metaphor is that basically on add takes its and prototypes basically have a rich uncle.
yeah, you could probably do a whole genealogical family type metaphor for an intro to Tinderbox.
Well, I think taking that a step farther, and this is one of the things we did in my cohort class last week, is helping people understand the concept of a designator, right? And the context of where you are within your notes. I think that's incredibly important. So, for example, I've got this particular note selected, and then any action that I'm going to take within Tinderbox will revolve around whatever the designator is: parent, ancestor, children, descendants, sibling. So people understanding that context. The other thing that I wanted to say before I forget is, do people understand what a note is? Like, a note for me is like a stem cell, right? And that stem cell is loosely bound by, and when I look at that stem cell, what do I initially see? I see the name, and I see text. So if I go like here, add some text here. What do I see? Into Mark Anderson's point earlier, I see some text, and I see this white box here. What I don't think people really grok very quickly is, well, what is that? Well, this is a note, and the note is loosely is a stem cell. It's basically has all of the potential in the world to be anything you want it to be: heart cell, lung cell, entity cell, term cell, project, or whatever you want it to be. But people need to learn, well, what is name? It's $ name. What is text? It's $ text. It's nothing more than an attribute. And that attribute and name and text are at equal level to any other attribute in Tinderbox. You can manipulate them just as easily as anything else. And I think that's an important concept to eventually get across. Chuck, Roger, Mark, we got a lot of hands up. Let's let Roger go. He hasn't verbalized yet.
If I can press the damn button here. Well, yeah. A couple of thoughts. First, going back to my earlier comment about abstraction, the thing that you're talking about here, for example, attributes or action code, these are abstractions that somebody needs to be able to come to grips with. And for me, it's not a problem. I'm a professional software developer. Okay, that's not a problem. But somebody else isn't going to have much to anchor to in terms of their prior experience or existing abstraction. So the point is that how do you get them? What are these things that we need to get them to understand? But more fundamental to this is, let me come back to the learning objective, is if you're coming at this from the point of view of a brand new person, it's like, okay, it's Tinderbox, great, I can make notes, but I can make notes with the Notes app or anything else. If all they want to do is that kind of thing, then they're not going to be happy in Tinderbox. It's just not that kind of an app. So a question is, though, what can I do with my notes? What can I do with that stuff? And that's where the power of Tinderbox comes. But somehow that's got to get addressed before we get into action code and attributes.
Yep. So we're getting eventually. As teaching goes, just so we all know, these are more questions than they are learning objectives yet. I think the next exercise would be, after we go through this, is rolling these up to their 5 generalized learning objectives, and then those learning objectives would help us answer these questions. Mr. Chuck.
Real quick, a way to attack this is to think about what are the questions that this course, quote unquote, will answer.
Are answering.
Yeah. And for those, you derive learning objectives.
Mm-hmm.
But what are those key questions?
Okay. Okay. Mark or Chuck?
Chuck,
Go ahead,
you
Mark.
go first.
All right. So I wanted to throw out something else. I started out by saying, navigation is very important. If somebody approaches Tinderbox, and I think maybe the first major problem they run into in terms of, what do I do with this thing, is how to navigate around. And we discussed navigation and the implications for navigating to attributes and designators and all of that. And I think that's something that even programmers might find a little bit unusual about the Tinderbox concepts. But the other one that I think is very important and would probably be essential to making the self-learning exercise work is introducing links. What are links? Why are there different types of links? And how can you use links to, go from one place in your document to another place? Just jumping over all kinds of other stuff in between. That's a very important concept to get across. And if we're going to use Tinderbox as a self-learning tool, we're going to have to use links, because links will be the way that somebody goes from one place to another and then backtracks to come to something else they were interested in. So getting that across is very important. And perhaps, maybe you need to start almost out at the get set with someone coming in and present them with a series of what look to them like hyperlinks, and let them get started there and begin to see, the power of being able to work their way through different material, different exercises, different presentations, and maybe even going out to even other different applications.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I like it. Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, just quickly pick up on the thing of links. I was reminded for paper I'm writing at the moment, but it's probably about the case that about 2/3 of working age people, so between 18 and 60 something, post-date the web, or they left school, they left junior school, and the web was around. And in writing what I did, hyperdate predates the web. I'm not trying to be a smart aleck about it, but Tinderbox basically drew from experience. So Mark's been in the hypertext game since the 1980s. Story space, on which he had sort of adopted and has fostered since. Because they were starting to work on that in about 1984, if not earlier. So some of the stuff is nothing to do with the froth of web pages and clicky links. Yeah. Links actually have there's a lot of sort of thought and philosophy underpinning. Now, I don't mention that because I think we should bore the poor person who's just trying to write some notes with it. But it's just something to squirrel away at the back of the mind, that, and adding to Chuck's point about links are more than just lines you drag across the screen to make this thing point at that.
Well, and on that note, I had a great conversation with Ted Goranson 6-7 months ago, and he's one of the godfathers of all of this. And he had mentioned, like, when they were in the early days of building the internet, and he was part of that cadre of people that was doing that. There were 2 theoretical concepts about linking and about data, and one was called set theory, and the other one is category theory. And set theory says you've got node A and node B, and they link together. And category theory says you've got node A, node B, and there's multiple links, and those links have different link types. And he said one of the problems we one of the things we did is we actually built the internet using the lens of set theory. And fast forward now 50 years later, 40 years later, and because of AI, we're now finally getting to looking at the internet through the lens of category theory, which is hypertext, which is, just because two notes link to each other is actually not that important. What's really important is all of the multiple relationships and the different types of interactions that those notes have with each other is actually really where the knowledge is. And going back to more practical perspectives, that's what Bruce was saying earlier, right? He's got all of this information, but it wasn't until he could get the codependency coincidences in the timeline view that he got to see, hey, wait a minute. My brother was related to this artist where he screwed up the guy's table and they were friends. And it was the multiple layers of those connections between the different types of dates, text, people. That's where the power of a tool like Tinderbox and really where all of this is going. Mark, comment?
So back to sort of things that maybe more close to what we're trying to do is one of the things you first write is create a note. Do we actually understand really what that means?
What is a note?
So in a sense, I make a box appear and it has a label, but there's a richness behind it. And I'm not trying to get all metaphysical about it, but one of the things that actually, going back to sort of the literality of what you see for some people, that I can't just create a note. I now need to give it a shape and I need to do all this sort of stuff, or else somehow it doesn't feel right. And I think just addressing that, I mean, there is no right or wrong in what you do. You literally can just make a box, put something in and circle back later. I think getting people to understand that you don't have to do it all in the moment, because I've seen this. Again, it's a sense that if I don't do this now, how on earth would I change the shape of it or change the color? Which leads back to, funnily enough, the inspector. In the thread that started on the backstage about stuff being kind of too hard, there were a couple of interesting things there. And it goes back to a comment the chap made is, well, there should be a new that just has a new everything. And I'm not so sure about that, because the file menu is normally about making new files. So if it has a new something, but the create word, which actually turns up. So most of the things in the note metaphor is creator, this, creator, that. And there are a few things that don't necessarily fit well in that. But so maybe that create word is a good hinge point to allow people to think about, okay, well, you're not just making a thing to go in a thing. You're creating something that basically is a little container of all sorts of information, which are its attributes. So as a way, just the mere act of creating that, you've created this tiny little world. And I think it's quite useful, because otherwise you blow past it and you either just write a sort of bit of text and move on, or you never get anywhere because you spend the rest of the day trying to work out the whizziest colors. As regards the inspector, I think there is some work to be done. There is some lineage in this. There are things that have ended up in the inspector. We could argue for hours about if they're in the right place and right things. I think helping people understand that although there are 6 tabs in the inspector, they're actually at different scope. There's app, document, and then the rest of them are basically siblings. They're all something to do with the current note or current selection, and that's not immediately apparent. And I think even things like that help people understand that sort of where they go to look for things.
And I think there's an important concept that Bruce raised earlier, you just raised, Erwin just raised in the chat. And when I teach my class, I often talk about there's like 4 kinds of notes. There's your scratch notes, which are kind of your throwaway notes. There are your project notes. There are your resource notes, aka your Zettel, those notes that you're commonly refining and really making repurposable. And then there are your background notes, which what basically your functional notes. The notes that Tinderbox uses to do its thing and prototype. And I found when I teach people like this concept, one of the things I say is like, okay, I go like this and I create a new note. There is nothing special about this note other than it's a stem cell, meaning it can be anything it wants to be. And Tinderbox uses the values of the over 400 system attributes that it has for it to function. and for you to tell it what you want it to do with this thing I just called new note. So for example, what a lot of people don't realize, and they think that there's some like really arcane mystery about this magical thing we call a prototype, and there really isn't. All you need to do is to Dave Rogers' point earlier, the use of the on add function is really powerful. And if you add the built-in prototypes feature with a Tinderbox, all that's doing is creating a note called prototypes and automatically adding an on add command that says, when you add a new note to this folder, basically go in and check that box for you, and turning that note now into a prototype. And that prototype value can be accessible anywhere in your document. It's just a convention to stick it in the prototypes folder because it's easier to kind of, to Bruce's point about organization, it's easier to know all your prototypes are in one place. But I think that's one of the powerful things for people to really understand too, is all of the functionality of Tinderbox is simply driven from the values that you put in the different attributes. Dave Rogers.
Could you quickly summarize again the different types of notes that you?
Yeah. So for me, there's four types of notes, and there's a subcategory in one of them. The first one is scratch notes. These are like my throwaway notes, my half thoughts, my chum bucket. And honestly, I don't use Tinderbox for my scratch notes for that. I use Obsidian because there's so much noise in those scratch notes. Other people use drafts. Other people use notes, the Mac app. It's whatever works for you, but it's like and I use Obsidian too, because for me, scratch notes are accessible now. Obsidian's on my iPhone and on my iPad, and from my watch, I can access it across everywhere. So scratch notes are those like half thoughts. The next bucket of notes are what I call my projects or my writings or whatever context you want to use. It's my work. It's the articles, the books, the posts, the things I'm creating with Tinderbox. And my projects have two elements to it. I have actually the article. This is the article I'm writing, but then I'll also have my thinking notes that I'll be generating while I'm doing that, much like a series of notes that are a diagram, like what Chuck's diagram view. I'll have a series of notes that are my diagramming view. So it's part of my project. It may or may not make its way into my writing, or it may make its way into my writing by me taking a screenshot of that diagram that I created of those thinking notes and sticking it into the final output. So there's kind of my projects have two categories of notes: the actual output that I intend to have and the notes that I'm thinking with. My thinking notes, I guess, is what I'll call them. So number one, scratch notes. Number two is my project notes, and that project notes have two categories: my actual output notes and my thinking notes. The third category is what I call my resource notes. Other people call them Zettles. Other people call them atomic notes. And those notes are notes that I create that I very intentionally highly curate over time. Terminology, concepts about regulations, my thoughts about a particular research article that I spend months or even not even years rereading and continuing to break down. And I spend effort in those atomic notes to break them into as small granular detail as possible. My figures, all of my images, all of my videos, like, in other words, assets that I will repurpose and reuse across multiple projects in that individual Tinderbox file, or that I may copy and paste into other Tinderbox files. And then the fourth bucket is my backstage notes, or otherwise known as functional notes, meaning the notes that Tinderbox uses to function: templates, libraries, stamps, and or what I call my TBX config, the note that I use as like a note for global references. So, and for example, when I have my image notes and my resources notes, I don't want to necessarily have to reproduce the media path for everywhere, because I have a convention where all my images are in one place on my hard drive. And then I separate the different projects by a subdirectory in that path. So I can put in the TBX config note in the backstage the path to where those images exist And every note in my templates will refer to that global variable that is then accessible everywhere. So to summarize, scratch notes, project notes, resource notes, and backstage notes. Those are the 4 types.
Okay, those are very refined hierarchy category, or I can't think of the term, based on your experience. It might be a little intimidating to someone to be exposed to that early on. I don't have, I have the infrastructure, the backstage portion. That makes sense. Whatever Tinderbox document you want to live in, you probably want to build some infrastructure around that to facilitate whatever it is you're doing in that document. But I don't have, for me, the Marmot and Captain's Log are the project. There is no output. There is no objective. The main working in Tinderbox, making those notes is the objective,
Yeah,
and
for sure.
that
For sure.
they don't exist to support some other well, the Marmot does because it produces the blog, but I mean that's not the main point of it. So I think we just don't want to lose sight of the fact that a Tinderbox file can be a daily journal, that and you don't necessarily have to have throwaway notes. I mean, I'd say keep everything, whenever you write a note, save it, because you never know when it might come in handy. So those categories work for a productivity sort of point of view. But
But
if you're looking, I'm just saying, if you want to embrace Tinderbox as kind of a way to interface with your digital life, your everything box, your everything container, that you don't necessarily need a highly specialized structure of notes that.
well, let me pause. Let me pause you there, though, Dave. So I have an idea, so I throw it into a scratch note, and then that note starts to evolve. Maybe I wrote a paragraph, like a post for a blog article, and that moves into my project notes. And then in the process of writing that article, I realized, there's an image I want to include, or there's a term that I need to define. And so that project note now becomes 2 resource notes that I'll want to leverage later: an image and a term. And then maybe in that process, one of those scratch notes evolves to become a prototype or some other types of notes. So it's not like the 4 different categories of notes are, you stick a note in there and it forever lives there. It's constantly evolving and constantly changing, as they move in and out of their different states of being as the thinking evolves. And I think for me, that's a really powerful concept.
Right. I'm just saying that we not lose sight of the fact that you can have a rewarding experience leveraging Tinderbox as a tool in itself for organizing your own thoughts, for organizing your own life. I mean, what we all, had bought an Apple II in 1981. What did you get it for? I'm going to store all my recipes. Never did. I just played with it. But with Tinderbox, it actually records much of my life, and it makes it accessible to me when my fallible memory, and I enjoy learning how Tinderbox works with that. It's not it's the reward in itself, that you don't necessarily have to have a thesis or a presentation or something like that. You can just use Tinderbox to kind of help grapple with your existence.
Absolutely. And that's what Chuck's doing. That's what drove his diagramming view thing, is he was messing around with wiring thoughts in his house, and it kind of evolved to a monster for him. But yeah, it's cool.
Exactly.
Yeah, or what you're doing with your water flow, what you're doing a similar electrical
Yeah,
thing
but
for
I
your new
haven't done
house.
that in Tinderbox yet.
Yeah. All right, guys. So we're a little 5 minutes over.
Yeah.
Let's take 5 minutes to kind of wrap up a little bit. I mean, was this exercise valuable today? Interesting? Making progress? And any final comments that you want to have? Bruce, you just came off mute.
Yeah, I think it's a useful discussion. I don't know that we've solved the problems of the world here today, but I mean, one of the things that, I sometimes I feel like I'm just hanging on to the tail of the comet, and I have to tell you, it's always an enjoyable ride. because there's so many viewpoints. Everyone here is just so effing smart, and it's enjoyable. So I don't know that we were able to accomplish what you set out in the beginning. And what I keep thinking of is, I mean, for me, I like simple. I like starting off simple and basic with very few elements and then building from there. And that, and at the same time, I think to Dave, your point, there are so many different ways. I mean, for me, the most common, yes, other than working on the book, the most common way I use Tinderbox is I've got a series of records or I've got a project that I need to get done. I start putting the information in there, I reorganize it. It then acts as a writing tool for me, even though I confess I don't do my actual writing in Tinderbox. It organizes everything for me so then I can dictate and get done what I need to get done. And it's a very efficient process. So there's so many different ways people might use it. I mean, Michael, there's no question. You are the publishing house. You are, you know, you're your own agent. You get the whole thing done. And I don't think many people are able to accomplish that. And also to Dave's point again, I don't think everyone has that need. I think there's so many different ways that the more we explore different ways people are using Tinderbox and seeing what their process is, I find that very illuminating.
Okay, so let's pause there in our last couple of minutes. Can you give me, I like that statement. Can we throw out 3 concepts of need? So when we talk about need in Tinderbox, what comes to mind?
First was who has the need?
Mm-hmm.
Who are we addressing?
Okay.
My need, your need, a new Tinderbox user's need.
All right, and what are needs? Needs
Everybody has
are
different needs. Everybody has
Right.
different needs.
Yeah.
But
Right.
so. Give me a list. Throw out some examples of needs.
order out
Well,
of chaos.
Okay.
Right.
Anybody else?
Yeah, discovery of new relationships and ideas, latent
Okay.
things.
Okay.
It might also be, actually thinking on sort of Dave's comments and some of his blogs and things he's done along the way, it may be a sort of journal or record.
Okay. So journaling, recording.
Yeah, which probably invariably leads to some analysis, but I think the start point is if it's just Dear Diary, that's still not an
Hugely
uncomfortable
valuable
thing to do. Yeah,
Every therapist in the world will tell you maintain a daily journal if you can, right?
And
Yeah, it's
before the marmot, Groundhog Day essentially was.
all right. So we've got order out of chaos, discover new relationships, journaling, recording, analysis. Obviously, my big need is production output. What else?
I would say organize and think through a project. I have 4 summer programs coming up, and I've started a Tinderbox file to organize what's going to happen across all those sessions, what are the costs, what are the commonalities. So it just acts as a big project file, but it does much more than most other software would.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the one thing I really truly like about Tinderbox is it really has no boundaries. A lot of other software have very significant hard boundaries, and when you hit those hard boundaries, you're done. Yeah, whereas with Tinderbox, there really aren't any boundaries. You know, your data is open. You can always pull it out. You can move it other ways. There's always, to Dave's point about using Apple script, if you weigh your way into that, it's boundless. You know, if you're using the JavaScript visualizations, it's boundless.
a quick thought, and that is that, I mean, one thing is, if you're not sure why you're doing it, well, just go make the notes in something else like Apple Notes, and that may remind you why it is you didn't want to use, in other words, why you wanted something more, because often it's quite personal. It may be a facet of the thing you're trying to do, but knowing that you came to something richer for a reason is more of a bulwark against the sort of sense of, oh my God, it's all too much. You're doing it for a reason. You're doing it here because you can't do it there. Therefore,
Okay,
the learning you need to do is relevant.
And here's another need, and maybe you can help articulate this, Mark, because you often push me on this almost weekly. Why are you doing it? define your problem, right? So my need is, how do I define my problem? How do I actually define what it is I want to do? And I think it's really funny because you'll often think, oh, I know exactly what I want to do. Well, really? Can you write it down? Can you tell me what you want to do? And you're like, well, shit, I actually don't know what I want to do. So how would you articulate that? How would we capture that?
I've been doing that very publicly for about 20 years in ATB-ref, and I'm still not getting it right. So
yeah. So how do we articulate that? Like, problem statement. The need is problem statement refinement or some.
Maybe more generically, I think the thing that the common thing that many people are trying to do is to describe a problem to understand a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And Tinderbox is a good place to just throw down the things you know about the problem you're working on and say, oh, well, these are related. I mean, I have this bizarre capability that I've had throughout my entire professional life, going all the way back to just out of, through college. I find problems in systems that nobody else finds. I don't know why.
Oh, you're one of those guys.
I am
too. Get invited to many parties.
Bugs in a system, and it's an interesting issue, and part of it is that I think I learned early on, and probably because I grew up in a journalist house, to write things down, and in the process of writing things down, I see things, and so I think that to a large extent, the tool we want is the tool that allows us to just say, oh, I found that's another aspect of that problem.
Right. Well,
you think about it for a while, you sleep on it, and you say, and this is another aspect of that problem, until you get to the point where you can say, you understand your problem.
Yeah, and I think what you and what Dave just noted, and thing, one of the breakthroughs I had just hours before I took my dissertation on my doctoral qualifying exams is I was cramming and reading a book, and in the book, the author had said, "Writing is thinking."
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm like, holy crap! Right? That's really a powerful thing to learn.
Although I know people who write without thinking.
Yeah, well, that's true.
That's social media.
That's our government, but that's a different matter.
Well, no, but that's social media. That's why.
Yeah.
This is why journaling is important, because it's an act of introspection, and that is the most powerful thing you can do to leverage experience in your life, and whatever tool you want to do it in. But Tinderbox is a great one.
Yeah.
Agreed. On that note.
All right. Joe, Rod, do you have one last comment and then we'll wrap up for the day?
Yeah. In software development, we, particularly for safety critical systems, we start out by defining the subject matter of the system. That is, it's a process of discovery. And in this case, we're looking for the key abstractions, entities, and their interrelationships between things. And eventually we get to a point where we're happy with that. And then we move to, defining requirements, and requirements are described in terms of the vocabulary and relationships that were done in the discovery process. And that's kind of like how I think about Tinderbox in some sense.
Yeah, and on that note, one of the things Tinderbox helps me do, to that point of writing is thinking and separating things apart, is it's helped me to get better at separating the what, why, and the how. Right. Yeah. So if I can, as I write in this process, I can think about, okay, why do I want to get something done? What is it that I want to get done? And then what I've learned from Mark Anderson is then how do I do it? And the how part gets really interesting, because invariably there's 10 different ways to do it. And there's no real right answer, and and a lot of that how comes down to how much time do you have and how much do you want to learn? And invariably what I'll end up doing is, like, if I got to get something done tomorrow, I'm going to do exactly what Bruce does. I'm going to take that crap, pull it out of Tinderbox, throw it into Excel, and just get it done. Right. But then later down the road, if I then have time, well, maybe then I'll figure out, well, how do I build that template in Tinderbox? How do I automate that? How do I incrementally formalize that how? And to then Chuck's point earlier, Tinderbox teaches you to learn. And what I've learned along the way is all of those computing concepts that I did. Like, I remember the day 4 years ago when Paul Walters talked to me about regex. He's like, well, just use regex. And I'm like, what's that? You know, and then that opened up a whole 3-year exercise of learning learning the concept of project. But really, really exciting tool to open up the world if you let it. Okay, well, I don't want to be the final word. Anybody want to make a final comment? Bruce, close us down.
Time to play.
Close you down. This was fun.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. We will see you next week.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.